Hello, this is Wes at Bad Seed Games, and we're going to be picking up where we left off. And in the previous tutorial, we set up the cylinder to be a trigger point, so that whenever we enter it, it will freeze the camera in place while remaining focused on the player. Now let's go ahead and duplicate this, since we're going to be using it. The next one, and let's give it a different color for this next one. So this next one, we're going to be setting up a target point to move the camera towards. So instead of freezing in place, it's going to move to a particular place while still remaining focused on the player. And so let's get that going. Before we get too far, however, let's rename them. Alright, so now that we've got that going, let's give it a target to work with. So this is going to be pretty easy. It's just going to be a simple empty game object. Let's drag it in to be a child of this camera trigger with target, and let's name it appropriately. So, and let's reset the position so it goes right to the 0, 0 of its parent. And let's drag it over here. This is a nice place. Now, the way that the camera works is it will go to where the player is, but it isn't going to ignore the vertical. So if the player goes high or low, then the camera will go high or low. Now, since we're moving the target, if you wanted to, you could move the target to be way up here or way below here, or it all depends on how you want to set this particular shot up. Alright, so now that we've got that in there, let's go back to the player in the camera trigger system. Now right now we've got it set up so that it's going to assume that there is no trigger. So let's add a conditional statement to go through. Detect target. And let's give it a few events to work with. So actually, let's set this up first. So in the detect target, what we're going to do is we're going to grab the camera trigger and extract whether or not it has a target. So for that, let's use the game object is null, and you can find this in the logic subsection. And what this is going to do is it's going to test a variable, and if there is anything in it, it will then make a decision of either yes or no. So let's add the events in. Yes, null, and not null. So if it results with a null object, that means there's nothing in it. So let's go back to the no target. But if it isn't null, we're going to go into the next state. But before we get ahead of ourselves, we need to give it some information to work with. So let's add in two variables, trigger and target. Let's make them both game objects, since they're going to be working with game objects. Now, in the trigger event, we have an option to store the collider that it is collided with. In this one, let's go trigger. So therefore, when you connect with this one, it'll store that object, or if you connect with this one, it'll store that object. Alright, so now that we've got that information stored, we could do the game object is null on the trigger, but that's not what we want. Let's use it on the target. But as things stand, we need to feed it some information first. So let's use the get FSMs game object. First thing we need to do when we enter in this state is we need to get the FSM game object of a specific game object, and it's going to be trigger. Now before we get too far though, there's nothing in the trigger. And before we even get further, there's nothing in here storing any information. Because since we're working with finite state machines, it needs to know that there is a target, or whether or not there is or is not a target. So let's set that up. So add finite state machine. Let's have a variable of target. Now, the reason I'm adding them to both of them, you'll see in just a moment. So let's rename it. Let's call it trigger system. Alright, so since we have this set up, let's just right click and copy the finite state machine and right click and paste it. And in the one with the target, we're going to feed it information. We're going to hard code the trigger target into the target variable. So in essence, we now have this target variable has nothing in it, and this target variable has something in it. So when we extract that information, the game object is null, should have something to work with. But again, it's not working. So here's a workaround. See, the reason why it's doing it this way is at this point, trigger, the variable we're searching, doesn't actually have anything in it. So there is no information for this action to extract, so you can set it up. Now, you can manually type in this information, but that might get a little tricky. And also, if there are any typos or anything else like that, that will make this action fail to work. So a way around that, well, two ways around it actually. You can either, in the game object, you can drag the object you're going to test, set up the actions, or you can set in the variable and do the same in here. Now, however, my personal preference is to go with this way, because then I absolutely know for certain that all the information is right in there, and there's no chance for mistakes. And since we now extracted the target, let's store it in target. So now target has something to work. The game object is null, has something to work with. So if it is null, let's go is null. And if it is not null, let's go not null. Now before we exit this, let's go back into the get FSM game object and switch this back to the trigger variable. Since this information will stay, it will remain in this action. So you can have get FSMs dynamically update and everything else like that. Alright, so in this one, let's give it a name. Since this is the action this is the state that it's going to go to if there is a target to work with. So target available. Let's add in the transition and another state to go to. And we're going to need two actions in here. The first is in this one, there is a target that it's going to work with. So let's tell the camera what that variable is. And for that one, we'll use the set FSM game object. Alright, so in this one, we're going to specify an object, and we're going to drag the camera matrix directly in using the movement. And since there is no variable game object in the camera, let's get this one set up. So target. Okay. Now it's there. Set it up. And we'll feed it the information target. Okay. Now the next thing we have to do at this point is, since we now have the system set, we have to set up an action that will correspond with what the target will do. So let's add a new state, add a global transition of target. Now before we continue, I'm just going to explain a few things. If you've probably noticed, you'll notice that these actions have already been defined. Now the reason why they're here is because the way that I work on tutorials is that I build up the scene that I need first, and then I strip it down in steps. Now sometimes I'll forget to take some of these actions out, and in this case it is the case this time. Normally I would declare them all, but if you followed through the other tutorial that I have here so far, you should already be familiar on how to create events and declare them as globals. But there is one thing that I think I have not discussed, and that is the event browser. The event browser you can easily access by going into the editor windows of the Playmaker menu and click on event browser. It'll open that up here. Now I prefer to have it docked here because the reason why I prefer to have it here is that when you're adding an event, you can either type it or you can click these arrows and select from the list that pops up. But as your game progresses, this is inevitably going to start getting cluttered with a lot of events. And navigating through this one, it's handy when the list is small. It's even more handy in this one since it's a standard window and all you have to do is just make sure the machine is open and, for example, just double click on an event to add it in. Okay, so now that we've got the target action, what are we going to do here? In this, we're going to use the iTween movement. Now the iTween features, they're actually quite powerful, but they can be a little intimidating. So I would highly suggest you just dive right in and play around with them. You're not going to get the results that you expect first time out, but keep trying. They're quite powerful for what you need. Now granted, they're not perfect for absolutely every situation, but they are great for some of the ones that you will be using them for. In this one, we're going to use the iTween Move 2. And the reason we're going to be using the iTween Move 2 is because of the ease types. Now the easing type is, for example, say easing in and easing out, linear, punch, spring, all those types of things. If you're familiar with animation, the technical side of animation, you should already be familiar with a lot of these terms. Basically what it means is that the linear, which is what a lot of standard translation movements are, it will go from point A to point B at a solid rate. Now, it will work, but it tends to look robotic. If you get the chance to use a nice ease in and ease out, or an ease in and an ease out, it'll give you a nice smooth transition, which will help prevent the player from getting their visuals jarred. So for this, let's choose ease in out sign, and the duration that we want to go, it's about 2 seconds. Alright, so we also have a target that we have fed it. So let's feed that into the transform position. And the next thing that we need to do is, now that we've got the set FSM, it's setting the target, we need to tell the camera matrix to toggle the target target action. This one's real easy to do. We can just go into the no target, copy the send event, and paste it in here. And we're going to change the event to send to target. And once that's done, finished, and wait in the trigger for it to exit. Now there is one more thing we need to do. Since we're using the finished to determine when this state is done, as soon as this clicks, it's going to say, oh, okay, I'm done. But the get and the set FSM actions are a little bit beefier, so just to be on the safe side, we're going to give it a little bit of a pause by using the next frame event. What this is going to do is it's going to wait until the next frame fires before it calls the finished. This will give us enough time to do what we need it to, and then click over. Alright, so let's give this a shot. Now this is going to highlight something which I had hoped would happen, and as we enter, you notice that the camera goes really weird. The reason why is that the camera's orientation has changed, and that is because in the iTween Move 2 there are additional features. We have the basic translation, but we also have a look at, path, and events. These three options are all usable as you need, but the one that we're going to toggle off, which comes toggled on by default, is the orient to path. What this means is that when it fires, it's going to look towards its target. So let's give this a shot now with that toggled off. And it's transitioning nicely and transitioning back. right. So at this point in time, this chapter is finished, and we've been able to set up the 2 trigger points to do what we need it to do. So for the next video, we're going to be covering the next few steps of the teleport and then the boss encounter camera, or the event camera. But until then, if you like this video, feel free to comment and rate it however you like. And if you feel so inclined, feel free to subscribe. But other than that, I hope you have a great one, and I'll catch you later. Bye.